Okay, so once again, good afternoon. No, so this time our topic, of course, the enterprise architecture. No, project management focused on budget and deliverables, no tracking deliverables. So in project management per se, it is to produce a result that will serve a purpose in the project. No, so it could be a software program, nor a building for a school, or translation budget for a documentation department, or a training program. So in project management per se, all these things had one name, no, that is deliverable. So deliverables can be tangible, like a new refrigerator; intangible, like broadening a business network; even the preparation to create a deliverable, such as training or buying new equipment. It can be deliverable in the project plan, since deliverables are as a result of some activities or effort. They must also be measurable and specific. And I think everything in your office, no, or home likely started as a project deliverable, no. So the chairs are manufactured to meet specific on a deadline, and so on and so forth. And project management, actually, so deliverable is simply a product or service created to achieve a project objective. So size doesn't matter. So a deliverable can be larger or small, a shopping mall, or a translator vendor analysis report for a documentation team. So of course, we need to consider some standards, no, some attributes for the project management deliverable, specifically for enterprise architecture, no, because deliverables can also deliverables of their own, no. So some project management professionals view milestone, no, as a kind of deliverable, but others characterize them more broadly, no. And among project management deliverable, there is a distinction between project and process deliverables. We consider budget, scope, no, and time, of course. It's also considered. So to give us more details about the topic, let us all welcome our presenter for this afternoon. Go ahead, sir.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jetro Ventura, MIT, and today we're going to discuss about EA Program Area 6, Deliverables and Tracking. This is a requirement under enterprise architectures. First, we discuss what is enterprise architecture. An enterprise architecture framework such as Scott Bernard's EA Cube, the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF, or Zachman is a tool to align strategy, business, and technology. As they say, enterprise architecture is equals S plus B plus T, or strategy, business, and technology. It is built up from many different artifacts such as strategy plan, SWOT or SWOT analysis, operating scenarios, process modules, data entity schemas, data models, use case, investment business cases, workforce plans, and others. Today, we're going to discuss about the deliverables overview and give you some examples regarding the deliverables. For deliverables overview, we're going to discuss about the EA project plan. It is based on the EA implementation methodology, the documentation, and the schedule. This chapter describes the EA implementation methodology, EA methodology, which is a detailed procedure for establishing, maintaining, and using an EA framework and documentation approach. The EA methodology is the first step in coordinating the EA documentation approach. The value of adopting an EA methodology is that it reduces the risk of creating ineffective EA program or an inaccurate EA documentation. So for this chapter, we have these key terms, the EA framework and EA methodology. EA framework is a structure for organizing information that defines the scope of the architecture, what the EA program will document, and the relationship of various areas of the architecture. The EA methodology defines the EA will be implemented and how documentation will be developed, archived, and used, including the selection of frameworks, modeling tools, and online repositories. Introduction. So for the introduction, EA methodology is a detailed step-by-step description of how the EA program is to be established and run, and how the documentation of the EA is to be developed, maintained, and used. The figures provides an overview of the 6 basic elements of the EA documentation. This builds on the basic establishing a 4-phase, 20-step methodology to establish an EA program and implement the 6 EA documentation elements. Home architecture analogy. So parang ganito lang 'yan, yung parang bibigay tayo ng example na parang sa paggawa nga ng bahay. An EA methodology is like the standard approach that architects are taught for designing and constructing a home. So there are things that must be done in a certain way and order for the design to be successful and for the home to be properly constructed. So parang ganun nga, kailangan sundin mo yung process or yung sabi nga order para ma-construct ng maayos yung isang bahay. So kapag hindi mo nasunod yun, pwedeng mag-fail ka sa ibang aspects na pwedeng makaapekto sa overall performance or overall na build ng bahay mo. So next for the discussion. The establishment of an EA program has many facets, and one of the key to success is to use a detailed documentation methodology to get the program started and then to guide the EA documentation effort. Depending on the type of enterprise, some parts of the EA methodology may be changed. So the EA methodology described in this topic is generalized so that it can be used in a wide variety of public and private sector enterprises and can support many types of EA frameworks, tools, and repositories. Pero yun nga, sabi nga, depending on the type of the enterprise, some parts of the methodology may be needed to be changed. So para mag-fit siya dun sa enterprise. It is important to develop an EA methodology as one of the first steps in establishing the EA program because it forces the enterprise to think through the following important considerations. So ito yung mga important considerations na dapat talaga isipin sa pagbuo ng EA program. First is which areas of the enterprise the EA will cover or the scope. Then next thing to consider is the approach to the EA governance. Will it be centralized or decentralized? Then next is the type of EA documentation or known as artifacts. Later, i-explain yung artifacts that will be needed to support business and technology resource planning and decision making. Fourth is the EA documentation framework that best support the needs of the enterprise. Then the methods and techniques for gathering or developing the EA documentation. Next is the software modeling tools, web applications, and database that will be needed to automate documentation techniques and enable future scenario modeling. Seventh is how EA users will access and share EA documentation or EA repository. Then next is how often EA documentation will be updated. So malalaman natin kung bakit magiging importante yung mga bagay na yan mamaya as we discuss this chapter. So next is the enterprise architecture implementation methodology. The 20 steps process which will be presented as an example in EA implementation methodology that contains all of the general steps that will support the creation of a new comprehensive EA program. So as I said earlier, pwede siyang for a new EA implementation or pwede rin siya to update an existing system. So ito yung mga phases na kailangan or parang guide for the EA implementation. So it should be noted that the revitalization of an existing EA program will involve additional steps that may vary with each situation. Revitalization could focus on the selection of different EA frameworks and implementation methodology, and or the identification of new vertical and horizontal partitions of the enterprise that is being documented. So for the phase 1 is EA program establishment. Phase 1 activities are designed to get the EA program initially started, identifying the key players and the communicate the EA implementation plan to executive sponsors and other stakeholders in order to gain buy-in and support. So yung executive sponsor, yun yung executive who has the decision-making authority over the whole EA program, and he is the one who provides resources and senior leadership for the EA program. These pre-documentation activities are important to ensure that the EA program has clear goals and so that they can remain focused and is accepted throughout the enterprise. So for the next phase naman is the phase 2, EA framework and tool selection. So mamaya mas mapapaliwanag natin yung mga phases na yan. So for the next phase after that is the documentation of the EA. Then for phase 4 is the use and maintain the EA. So the EA program is essentially a startup project. So yung phase 1 to phase 3, yun yung parang before the project. So parang yun yung mga kailangan nyo ma-accomplish. Then kapag ongoing na yung EA program niya, yung phase 4 naman ang ina-execute natin, yung use and maintain the EA. So sa next slides niya, mapapaliwanag pa natin in detail yung mga phases na yan and yung mga steps within. So phase 1 is EA program establishment. So as explained earlier, this is the first step ng EA implementation. So in step 1, establish the EA management program and identify a chief architect. So the first step is for an executive sponsor to establish an EA program and identify the chief architect to lead the program. So the executive sponsor must provide the chief architect with enough resource, or example, the budget, the personnel, hardware and software, and other facilities that may be needed, and the authority that to be able to properly establish the EA program. So the chief architect should be accountable for the program resources then. So yun. One of the chief architect's first action should be to establish an EA team that is consists of trained EA architects and representatives of various stakeholder groups. So for the next step, yung step 2 is establish an EA implementation methodology. The second step in the EA methodology is for the chief architect and the EA team to identify all of the steps in the methodology. So to that the enterprise needs in order to create an effective EA program. So parang yun yung planning stage naman. The methodology example in this presentation is can be used as it is presented, or it can be modified to meet the particular needs of the enterprise. So gaya nga nun, every enterprise has a different approach or may need a different set of steps or different types of methodologies, or yun, kung paano yung pag-execute. You may also use other methodologies, sabi nga nila. So either from the public or private sector. The important thing to remember is in starting an EA is to have a detailed methodology that will guide the program implementation and subsequent documentation activities, as well as reduce the risk of the EA program losing focus and effectiveness and value. So for the next step is the step 3, establish EA governance and links to other management process. The third step is for the executive sponsor and chief architect to co-develop an approach to EA governance that enables effective policy, planning, decision making within the EA management program. So this approach to EA governance should include links to other management process for strategic planning. So next is the step 4, or develop an EA communication plan to gain stakeholders buy-in. So the next step is to develop an EA communication plan that articulates the EA documentation methodology and a schedule for phase 2 and phase 3 activities. The EA communication plan should be written in plain language. Why? This is to gain the stakeholders buy-in from non-technical executives, line of business managers, support staffs, and other potential end users of EA documentation. This will enable them to better understand better understand the EA documentation. The communication plan should include statements about the purpose and vision of the EA. Examples of how the EA will bring value to the enterprise, where EA documentation will be available for access, a summary of the methodology used, and the general principles that will be used for EA development. So that's all for the phase 1. So next is the phase 2, which is the EA framework and tool selection. So phase 2 activities takes place when the initial set of EA documentation is developed. This begins with the selection of EA documentation framework that will identify the scope of the architecture, guide the techniques for the modeling of current views, develop future scenarios, and associate modeling, and establish an online repository will be archive of all the EA documentation artifacts. So what is an EA artifact? An EA artifact is a documentation product It may come in forms of text document, system specification, application interface, information, or a diagram or a spreadsheet, or it also may be a briefing slides and or a video clip. So this type of documents can be called an EA artifact. So for the next step is the step 5, the first step in phase 2. Select an EA documentation framework. So the first step is involves the selection of the EA documentation framework. It will be made by the chief architect. So with input from the EA team and the other stakeholders. The framework should identify the areas of the enterprise that the EA will cover and how those areas relate. So for the next step is identify EA lines of business, crosscuts, and the order of the documentation. The next phase involves the identification of the vertical lines of business, or which is also called a segment, and the horizontal cross-cutting initiatives within the enterprise that can be separately architected and when combined will represent the EA for the entire enterprise. So sometimes distinct vertical LOBs or line of businesses are readily apparent, such as functioning subunits of an organization. An example of this could be the manufacturing division, sales and marketing division, research and development division, administration and finance division, something like that. So how sometimes, however, the LOBR segment is something that makes sense within the EA and is not an established organization boundary. So it must be identified through work with stakeholders. For example, vertical supply chains, mission-specific capabilities. Then for cross-cutting initiatives are those horizontal activities with which function in a common operating environment across several LOBs. So example of horizontal crosscut includes web services, knowledge warehouse, network infrastructure, security solutions, ERP modules, and back office systems and applications such as email, document tracking like finance and accounting, and human resources applications. So next is for step 7, identify the EA components to be documented framework-wide. So the next step is step 7 of the EA documentation methodology is to identify the EA components that will be documented in each functional area of the framework. So each EA component is documented using information gathering methods and modeling techniques that are appropriate for the type of things that are contained in the EA component. So for example, the EA Cube framework has 6 functional areas. So the strategy, business, information, services, network, and vertical threads. Each of these areas represents a distinct set of activities that extend across the enterprise, which are represented by different EA components. And EA components are plug and play goals. It may also be a process measure or a project, data service, and or IT resources in various functional areas. As an example, at a strategic level, uh, the enterprise strategic goals, activities, and outcome measures are the primary items to be documented. So for at a business level, the line of business services and associated measures are documented. While at an information level, the flows of information or the database, knowledge warehouse, and these data standards are documented. While at the services and application levels are the various web services, office automation services, and the software applications are documented. And at a technology infrastructure level is the voice, the data, video networks, as well as associated cable plants and equipment facilities are documented. So for vertical threads, IT security information, IT standards, and IT workforce information are gathered. For associated activities and resources in each of the five other functional areas. Then for the next step is step 8, select documentation methods appropriate for your framework. The next step is to select the methods that will be used to gather and develop the EA documentation artifacts. So we will be using some examples we have identified on the previous steps. So yun nga, yung gaya ng sinabi ko sa step 7. So parang ganyan, on the strategic level, there will be strategic plans, scenarios, and or balance scorecards. Then on a business level is type of IDF zero diagrams or flow charts or swim lane charts. For information level, we're going to use data models, object diagrams, data dictionary. Then for service level is system diagrams, web service models, and other APIs. So on technology level is the voice, data, or video network diagrams or documents. Tapos sa vertical threads nga is security diagram standards and workforce skills. It is important to choose documentation techniques that will provide the information that is needed for research planning and decision making, because all of these type of techniques that we're going to use is what would make up the documentation, and it will be used by future end users, so to better understand the EA program. So therefore, the chief architect should consult with EA stakeholders and the EA team in selecting these kinds of methods for artificial development and what type of information will be gathered. So then the next step is the step 9. Select software applications, tools to support automated EA documentation. So once the functional areas or level of the framework and the types of EA components are known, EA documentation and artifact modeling requirements can be established. Without doing the previous steps, the 7 and 8, it will be very difficult for the chief architect and the EA team to know the particular modeling techniques that they will have to support. Also, several types of EA documentation tools may be required, as they may be a requirement for a general EA modeling tool or several specialty modeling tools and general documents or spreadsheets and graphics applications. So for the next step is select and establish an online e-repository for documentation and analysis. For the last step for the second phase, is for the chief architect and the EA team to select an EA repository software application and database. The EA repository should be hosted on the enterprise internal LAN, LAN or local area network for security, and it would also be for the ease of access to the EA documentation. The EA repository is a database and a file directory where all EA documentation is archived. So one method to promote ease of access, ease of use is to establish an EA website that is the front door for all EA program activities and documentations. Then this website homepage can be designed to promote a clear view on the scope of the EA documentation that is available. Then for the next phase is the third phase, the documentation of the EA. So phase 3 activities are where the actual development of the EA occurs in the form of documentation artifacts. This involves analyzing and documenting the current strategy, business information, services, and infrastructure of the enterprise. It also involves the development of artifacts that reflects changes in the resources in the short term and the development of a group of long-term future scenarios to identify possible courses of action and resource changes that will be needed in response to different internal and external influences. So there, we should proceed to the next step 11, the evaluate existing business and technology documentation for use in the EA. The first step of the third phase is the beginning of the actual EA documentation activities. So preceding activities establish what will be documented and how it will be documented and who will do the documentation. So after identifying what are the EA components at each level, we now document the existing and new artifacts that will be needed. In many ways, this activity is like taking an inventory of the components like the strategic goals, business services, measures, data, services, and other IT resources that may have already exist in the enterprise, and then mapping them to the existing documentation. So for the next step is step 12, document current use of existing EA components in all framework areas or the level and threads. So the second step of phase 3 is the development of new artifacts to complete the documentation of all existing components. The documentation methods and tools identified in step 8 or the select documentation select documentation methods appropriate for the framework. So excuse me, are used to gather and standardize the existing artifacts as well as to develop new artifacts. It is advisable to store artifacts on an online repository as mentioned earlier, diba? So it will be easier to access those kind of documentations that will be needed. So for the next step is the step 13, develop several future business and technology operating scenarios. So this is one of the reason why we should store the artifacts on an online repository for future business and technology operating scenarios. So prior to developing future views of EA components, it is helpful to gain a high-level understanding of the possible future directions that the enterprise could take, or depending how it responds to internal and external influences. So on this step, three or more feature scenarios should be optimally be developed with EA and line of business stakeholders to reflect what may occur if A, the status quo is maintained, or B, an optional business technology operating environment is encountered, and C, a high threat survival situations. So there are several beneficial outcomes from the development of these scenarios. So first, the enterprise is more prepared and organized to handle future situations and plan the needed resources. So second is a number of planning assumptions are identified in each scenario that reveals what the priorities of the enterprise might be if the scenario is pursued. Then next is, or another benefit is, the planning for future capabilities is more coordinated with the business managers and the technology manager. So that's all for the step 13. So we proceed to step 14. The identify future planning assumptions for each future scenarios. So each future scenarios describes in story form. So a possible business technology operating environment that the enterprise might pursue or face. So in this step, the key element of each future scenarios are analyzed to reveals what what things are important for the enterprise and what changes have to occur for a scenario to become a reality. So for the purpose of the EA, these key these key elements become the planning assumptions that can be grouped together to represent change in each of the functional areas of the framework. One of the benefits of having this scenario is and planning assumption is that they were developed with stakeholder buy-in, which will help when future changes are implemented because they were already informed of like what they can do if something happened. So next is step 15, or the use the scenarios and other program staff input to drive the documentation of future EA components in all framework areas. So this step involves the documentation of the changes to EA components in the near term. It can happen from around the first 2 years, and also the longer term, which may happen 3 to 5 years. So these changes should be retrieved from the input by the leadership team via the operating scenarios, planning assumptions, and form program and project managers who know what the future business requirements are, as well as plan system implementations, upgrades, and retirements. By doing it this way, the changes are more coordinated and aligned with the strategic direction of the enterprise. So this helps to more clearly identify what the changes are in each of the functional levels of the EA framework, which helps in the planning and the decision making. So as mentioned earlier, it is advisable to store artifacts on an online repository for ease of access and also for the security of these documents. So for the last step on the third phase is develop an EA management plan to sequence plan changes in the EA. Excuse. sorry. The final step in phase 3 is the development of the EA management plan. So this plan serves to articulate how the EA was developed and provide a synopsis of the current and the future views. The plan also provides a transition and sequencing subplan for the near-term changes, which may already be in the project pre-implementation stage. Also, a long-range sequencing subplan is provided that covers the potential changes associated with the future scenarios. So that's all for the third phase. So next and the last phase is phase 4, use and maintain the EA. So phase 4 is an ongoing set of activities that promotes the use of EA information by all stakeholders and establishes an annual cycle for updates. So this is where the value of the EA program is realized as planning and decision making throughout the enterprise are supported. So this value is maintained through regular updates of the current and future views of the architecture. Value is also gained in the maintenance of the EA repository and the maintenance of all associated software licenses for modeling and archiving. So the first step is step 17, which is the first step in the phase 4 is use EA information to support planning and decision making. So upon the completion of the phase 3, the current and future views of the architectures are stored in the EA repository and are ready to be used by the enterprise to support planning and decision making. So these EA stored artifacts become a baseline of reference information that can be used in a wide variety of executive management and staff activities. So when this is done, a greater level of understanding is developed of capabilities and performance gaps among wider groups within the enterprise. So further, by having the EA documentation in an online repository, this information can be called up and referred to in meetings. So EA documentation on the current and possible future views of the information flow could be called up from the repository and projected to the meeting. So this along with information on the associated business services and support applications and network can be referenced meaningfully. So this could also stimulate a more productive discussion and an informed decision. So next is the step 18. So regularly update current and future views of EA components. So the information in the EA repository is valuable for planning and decision making only as long as it is a comprehensive and accurate. So therefore, it is important to regularly update the current and the future views of the EA components in all areas of the framework. Also, it is important to maintain a version control in between updates so that all of the users of the EA information may know that they are using the or conducting planning and decision making activities based on the same information. So since what is planned in the future EA views will eventually become the current architecture or at least some of it, it should be recognized that EA updates are ongoing activities that do not cease. So future EA plans will continue as an organization grows and changes. So next step is the maintain an EA repository for modeling and analysis products. So the chief architect and EA team need to ensure that EA repository and support application tools are kept current in terms of licensing and functionality. So the requirements for archiving and modeling should be reviewed annually, and new products should be regularly reviewed to ensure that the EA team has the right application support capabilities. So the team should be on the lookout for new improvements in tool functionality so that these improvements could also be applied as an advantage for the enterprise. So the cost for software purchases and license renewal should be part of the annual EA program budget. So for the last step is step 20. Release annual updates to the EA management plan. So the chief architect needs to regularly inform EA stakeholders about the status of the EA. So this is done through the annual release of an update of EA management plan, which discusses changes that were made to the current and future views of DEA during the past year. So the communication should provide a transition and sequencing plan for changes anticipated during the coming year. Also, the ongoing value of the EA needs to be communicated through the citation of examples where EA documentation supported planning and decision making. So it helped reduce duplicative capabilities and save cost and improve alignment and increase communication. So next is for the deliverable examples. So here we have a sample for a statement of work or and also for a program plan. So wait, let me share you. So for the work statement, here's an example that I have found on the web. So this is for a reference only as stated. So what we have here is a sample of a documentation that would include the brief description of the service, statement of work, then introduction, which defines the requirements and work scope for supporting installations in the conduct of enterprise architecture support and portfolio management activities, including support of annual system reviews. So it would include the scope of work, objectives, the tasks that would be needed, or the enterprise architecture support. So this is just an example of what a document may look like. On the next example that I have, uh, it's more like an example na mas okay siguro. Wait, share. So here. So this is an example that I have taken or I have borrowed from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is a program file, a program architecture plan. So as we have mentioned earlier, here we have the publication version control so that the entire EA team would know which version they are using. So they would also be in line, or the information shared across would be the same. So here are the table of contents as we have mentioned earlier. What are the needed for this program? So It should also include the other considerations as you can see here on 9 and 10. So the website considerations, procurement considerations, testing considerations, training considerations. So these parts are, for example, for a training consideration or in testing coordination considerations, they might need different types of applications that should be in license. So to be enabled to proceed with the testing or training of other users. So also they should also include the costing for the annual costing din. So yun siguro sa procurement considerations na it should state that each year may the enterprise may need to cover this type of costing for the, for example, for the testing and training considerations, that there might be applications needed, or to maintain the program you have to pay these licenses for the programs. So yan. So we have to go back to the presentation. So yun yung two examples. So you can download it also on this website sa Virginia Information Technology Agency for the Program Architecture Plan Template and the Enterprise Architecture Portfolio Management Statement of Work or SOW sample in NIH Information Technology Acquisition and Assessment Center. So summary. As summary, the EA program is initially a startup project. So yung phase 1 to 3 is from the startup project. Then when it's already an ongoing program, then we have to execute the phase 4. So what are these phases again? Phase 1 serves to establish the EA program. So we have to identify a chief architect to lead the program, create an EA governance capability to run the EA program in a way that it that integrates with other IT management processes, and issue an EA communication plan to gain stakeholder buy-in and support. So for phase 2, it serves to select an EA framework that defines the scope of the architecture, the EA components that will make up the architecture in such functional areas, and software applications or tools to automate the documentation of the EI components. So for phase 4 is where the actual documentation of current and future views of the architecture occurs, as well as the development of an EA management plan to describe how the architecture will transition over time. Then next is the phase 4. This is where DEA is used throughout the enterprise to support planning and decision making, and regular updates are performed to keep DEA relevant and adding value. So we have to also know that the revitalization of an existing EA program will involve additional steps that will vary with each situations. So revitalization could focus on selection of different EA framework and implementation methodology, and or the identification of new vertical and horizontal partitions of the enterprise that is being documented. So yan, that's all. Thank you for listening today. Hope you have a great day. Keep safe and God bless.
Radyo. Okay, so okay, thank you very much, no, sir, for your comprehensive discussions about the topic, no. And again, it is important, of course, for us to have a to process all the managing deliverables, no, and because when you embark on a project, it should be obvious what you're going to create, no. So unfortunately, what we're going to do is to start early, no. You need to consider, no, start early. Let's say, for example, it is best to define what you're creating before the team begins work. No, you need to consider your objective, no. Your product or outcome will be based on your objective. Then break it down, no. Once you have stakeholder approval, you can determine what things are needed to complete the deliverables and how long it will take, no. So, and track that task, no. It is also advisable for us to create actually a how do you call this one? Hmm, I forget the exact term, but most commonly for us to detect. So let's say our target is for 1 week, then we could able to finish in 3 days, no? And okay, we need to create that diagrams, no? Because stakeholders, let's say, for example, in upper management, are concerned with progress of the project and higher level deliverables. So if ever, let's say, for example, you are the EA manager, you and your team leaders will track the progress of task, no? Provided that the software can help you to record, track, and share information about all the deliverables, task, milestone, and of course, dependencies. Again, we need to understand the details of deliverables and their acceptance criteria. It must be captured internally in the project scope statement and externally in the contract with the customer. Okay, so you need to figure out everything, no, with regards to that. So let's say, for example, what are we trying to achieve? How we're going to achieve this? What are the things needed to help us achieve this? No, and during planning, we need to consider who and what is needed to achieve, create these deliverables. So what does this deliverable achieve? What does this deliverable encompass? No, when it comes to controlling, are we on track to provide these deliverables? No, do we still have the resources to complete these deliverables, and is this deliverable still relevant to the scope of the project? No, we need to consider all those things, no. And or easily track and manage project deliverables, no. Actually, we have a lot of available software, no, in the market, no, like let's say Smartsheet, no. It is a work management and automation platform that enables enterprises and teams to work better. So tracking project deliverables has never been so easy. So again, maybe, no, you have a powerful and intuitive project management tools, no, found in a Smartsheet. No, hold your team accountable by providing visibility into the team priorities and sending out real-time updates. As the EA project managers, you need to appreciate and enhance reporting features that provide rich real-time metrics that summarize progress and increase stakeholders' confidence. You need to create a self-service reports and dashboard to view resources, uh, status, and performance in an instant. Now, it is very important. Okay, so I think that's it for today. Thank you, sir, for your presentation.